Good morning from Edinburgh here. My name is V.K. Dougal and I work for the Asian Development Bank. A very warm welcome to all the participants to this session on the opening day of the COP26, Operationalizing Article 6, State of the Play from the MDB perspective. I think this topic is going to be very interesting and something that all of us are going to be watching very keenly as the negotiations progress here in COP26. I think the audience is very well aware about the latest IPCC report, which recognizing the gap, the code red for humanity highlights the substantial gap in the global efforts to meet the Paris goals. And the UNEP's latest emission gap report published in lead up to the COP26 also suggests that the current policies would lead to a temperature rise of 2.8 Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. This means very clearly that the urgent action is required. This is clearly a very important issue and a very, very significant global problem, but at the same time, it requires a global solution. So when we talk about the global solution, then we talk about the cooperation among various stakeholders, various countries and parties, and that's where Article 6 of the Paris Agreement comes into the place. So it is very, very urgent for countries to not only pursue their mitigation targets articulated in their NDCs, but also work towards raising their ambition moving forward. And raising the ambition at the same time face multiple barriers, as we all know, and the barriers do include mobilization of climate finance and the diffusion of advanced low carbon technologies. So in that context, it clearly becomes very important countries to work together, and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement provides that platform that can help countries to collaborate using market as well as non-market approaches to come together, meet their NDC targets, and raise the ambition over a period of time. So this is very, very important. If the countries have to move toward transition towards net zero emissions, they have to use all possible avenues, all different instruments that are at their disposal, and Article 6 comes into play, which can facilitate, which can mobilize international carbon finance that can help countries to overcome some of these barriers, reduce the cost of achieving their mitigation targets, and raise the ambition over a period of time. But we also recognize that there are different challenges. Most important that the slow progress on the finalization of the rule book. But at the same time, as we move from Kyoto to Paris, the countries would need a different set of policy framework, institutional arrangements, and also would need to test out different approaches that are possible. We realize that the markets are going to be quite different under the Paris Agreement, and therefore countries would need to work on a different set of policies, institutional arrangements, and the infrastructure that is going to require to facilitate the operation of the markets. So in that context, the MDBs have come together and set up the MDB working group on Article 6. The idea is to build synergies among MDBs, and so that Article 6 could assume the right position, it can be leveraged and become a very important policy instrument for the countries to see how Article 6 fits into the broader climate policy architecture of the countries. And Article 6 work is seen in synergy with the broader work that the MDBs are doing to help their member countries. So in that context, the different MDBs have been working to support the countries in the different spheres, but making sure that all efforts are synergetic to each other. We are all working towards the creation of the next generation of carbon markets, and the countries are able to use these different market as well as non-market opportunities that are possible under Article 6 to achieve the goal of Paris Agreement. So today we have organized this session where different MDB colleagues are going to share their experience of what kind of work that has been done, what are their plans, and how we can together contribute to the development of the next generation of markets. Specifically, today's event is going to present updates on the Climate Market Club, on the Climate Warehouse, the carbon markets and climate governance linkages, Article 6 pilots, digitalized MRV and non-market approaches, and the adaptation benefit mechanism, and finally the Article 6 support facility that ADB has established. So without much ado, now let me kick off this discussion today. The way we have structured today's event is that we will have a short around 7 to 8 minutes of presentation from different MDBs. And after that, we would like to invite some of the comments from some of the experts that we are going to have for this panel conversation. So let me, first of all, invite my colleague, Mr. Chandrasekhar Sinha, who is advisor climate change group at the World Bank, and he is going to make a presentation on the rationale for Article 6, enabling early action and facilitating transition. Chandra, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, VK. Thank you for the great introduction. Let me try to set a little bit of a context beyond what you have indicated by focusing on the whole idea of the work that multilateral development banks are doing. Many of you are aware, and it's been highlighted in the recent report of the Standing Committee on Finance, the multilateral development banks provide somewhere of the order of $140 to $150 billion a year of new commitments for climate action. About 30 billion of that goes towards creating mitigation outcomes, and those mitigation outcomes certainly support countries, our client countries' efforts to meet their NDC requirements. But a part of that, or depending on the progress with the NDCs, we could utilize those investments for participation through international cooperation in Article 6. And that's basically what we're going to discuss more today, the effort of the multilateral banks in providing climate finance or climate-related finance, along with the associated analytical services or advisory services through which our clients are able to move forward with their ambition or climate action. The role of the multilateral development banks in this process certainly needs to be emphasized, needs to be recognized to be that of assisting countries or working with our country clients to move forward with the idea of a greater level of climate action. It's to conceptualize new approaches, it is to pilot programs, it is to develop capacity through that piloting and conceptualization process, in the process, of course, to channel greater level of investment for climate action, and in doing this to enhance international cooperation. And certainly, as VK indicated, the multilateral development banks recognize the need for us to cooperate together, work together, to leverage each other's capacity and efforts and focus in different parts of the world to make the overall effort much more effective. As far as the World Bank is concerned, certainly our work program is divided broadly along four buckets of activities and three vertical pillars: creating mitigation outcomes or the supply for the future carbon markets, certainly enhancing demand from buyers and our shareholder countries as well. And in order to facilitate all of that, to create the necessary market infrastructure, which would allow all of this to happen. And a cross-cutting theme of creating enabling environment, regulatory framework, or enabling regulatory framework, institutional arrangements, and governance arrangements, which allow the rapid scale-up of international cooperation through Article 6. And in that context, the Climate Market Club, which we can refer to and which I'll talk about in the next slide, is particularly important. The Climate Market Club is an effort to jointly develop a set of modalities for piloting which would inform the actual operationalization of Article 6 or carbon markets in general, and to ensure that all the club members recognize the primacy of the rules and guidance that emerges from the negotiation process through the Paris Agreement discussion process, to build capacity, to move from piloting to actual scale up. And as is shown on this slide, we have 13 members in the Climate Market Club, 13 sovereign members, and the club also has provisions for implementing partners of the sovereign members to participate as members as well, to provide their own knowledge, understanding, guidance that can emerge from the implementation expertise that the implementing partners also have. And the multilateral development banks form the secretariat to the Climate Market Club. Together, we do the technical work that is requested or follow from the guidance that is provided by the members of the club. The obvious expertise advantages of the Climate Market Club, the benefits that comes from it is to provide a platform for discussion, to think in terms of the details of the processes that would be necessary to operationalize the carbon markets, to offer practical lessons that emerge from the piloting and the experimentation that is taking place and that will take place as we scale up our efforts on operationalizing Article 6, and to provide template documents to build capacity and to, in general, serve as a platform which allows participating countries to understand and communicate to the broader community what seems to work, what seems to be effective, what the approaches should be. In that context, the Climate Market Club has been working on preparing approach papers, which would provide some lessons learned and guidance on how to move forward. And these are typically structured along a concept of providing ideas around how to operationalize the concept of environmental integrity, how to build host country capacities, what would be the role of infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure would be needed, how it could serve the reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement, how would it lead to greater integrity of the markets, how do you also move towards the utilization of existing infrastructure, including those of the independent standards, to build on the experience over the last 2 decades with the Kyoto-related market in the context of the Paris Agreement. And these approach papers are available on the web, and typically the idea is that the approach papers are utilized by countries wishing to move forward with the implementation or operationalization of the carbon markets to customize it in their national context and move forward with the implementation through that process. This slide gives you a sense of the range of papers that have been prepared or are under preparation, including that on operationalizing environmental integrity, on country processes, on the approaches for carbon asset development process, and overall policy framework that countries need to put in place, particularly for Article 6.2, such that there is greater clarity for those who wish to participate and invest in particular host countries to move the ideas forward. And you also listed here the project approach papers which are under preparation and should be coming in the next 3 to 6 months as well. The second idea that I did refer to is the need for a market infrastructure. As many of you recognize, Article 6 has a framework of a decentralized market approach or decentralized approach for operationalizing carbon markets, and it is intended to recognize the different national circumstances and approaches that countries may wish to take as they move forward with their NDC implementation, as they think in terms of raising climate ambition. This automatically implies that there are a number of ways by which a particular host countries or particular countries will begin to create data systems for monitoring, to facilitate, to report on the range of climate actions that would be necessary broadly as a part of the Paris Agreement, but also as a part of Article 6. And to recognize that in the case of Article 6, certainly it will be important to have registries or access to registries which are able to track and report on the carbon assets that are created, carbon assets that are transacted. And the role of the climate warehouse is to provide linkage across the different registry systems where carbon assets are created, issued, and transacted, and it comes from the recognition that having diverse set of registry systems creates particular challenges with regard to double counting, challenges with regard to tracking and accounting and reporting this in a way that enhances the credibility and the transparency of the market. So the role of the climate warehouse, as is summarized in this slide that you see now, is to build a global public data layer which connects the different registry layer, as you see on the slides, registries of different countries, of different standards, potentially even regional registries, or even those in the future once they are set up by the international process as well. And to have that reflected through emerging technologies such as the blockchain and distributed ledger technology, to create the transparency and trackability that is necessary for a reliable, credible, transparent market which services the carbon markets in the future. So those of you who are maybe interested in learning more about this, do get in touch with us, both for the climate warehouse, where we envisage cooperation between government and non-government entities which are beginning to service or provide service to the carbon markets, as I mentioned, the independent standards, other commercial services like the meta registry that was recently announced by IHS Markit, by whole set of other service providers who will begin to enter into the market to provide transparency and other kind of services as the ecosystem begins to develop. So with that, let me conclude here and hand over to Gerrit. Gerrit, over to you to describe the work of the EBRD, and I'll try to stop sharing my screen now. Okay, back to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chandra, and thanks, VK. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm happy to be representing the EBRD today on behalf of Jan Willem, who is typically running the show. Yes, following the wonderful work that Chandra just pointed out on behalf of the World Bank, I am going to give you a glimpse and some insights as to what the EBRD is doing in our region. We first of all recognize the huge potential of Article 6 and think that a broader uptake of carbon market mechanisms could offer much needed flexibility for countries to meet their NDCs, as well as to serve as a risk management tool in the transition to net zero. And we have And that's what you see on the screen. Conducted an Article 6 modeling study a while back for our region with the University of Maryland, which has shown that the international carbon markets in our specific region have the potential to reduce costs for implementing broader NDCs mechanisms by 53 billion by 2050. So while this, of course, is a theoretical modeling exercise, it just gives a glimpse at the massive potential, even if only a fraction of this could be achieved. And especially now, as we are in a COVID-19 liquidity constrained environment with fueling government debt levels, it is important to think about how to bring in the private sector in, which is why we are happy to see that a majority or a large portion of the recently updated and submitted NDCs indicate that countries are interested in working on Article 6 and international carbon markets, and that's a good basis to start with. Next slide, Zoe. Yes, so while we do recognize this potential, which was pointed out on the previous slide, we also need to remind ourselves that for markets to deliver the impact and deliver on this potential, they must be recognized appropriately by, among others, international initiatives and platforms that promote climate action through target setting, measurement, and reporting. Now, the reality today is that carbon market activities are to a large extent not recognized, or their role in different climate governance initiatives is restricted. This may not come as a surprise, as we know climate finance and carbon markets are to date deployed in a largely siloed manner, but it also shows that the connection between the disciplining force of carbon markets to save costs, to bring in the private sector at scale, and to leverage ambition seems insufficiently understood by some market actors, and that would need to be changed. We actually have been running a study to look into this issue a bit closer and looked at initiatives such as the Science-Based Target Initiative, climate risk and tracking initiatives, such as the recently developed EU taxonomy and TCFD, and there is basically room for more clarity, and it would be helpful if these climate governance standards can define or prescribe a more distinctive role for international carbon markets in supporting financial institutions to achieve net zero, and this would really generate a large scale of capital flows. Next slide. Now, from the EBID perspective in our region, we divide our work on the carbon market side across three types of activities. Some is policy dialogue, where we are essentially providing expertise on climate markets in long-term strategy developments, sector level roadmaps, or simply in updating NDCs and then defining NDC implementation roadmaps and considering in all of this the role of carbon markets in addition to international climate finance flows. And for instance, we are doing currently a carbon market scoping study in Uzbekistan and Georgia. And we see, of course, some potential in Article 6. We are doing feasibility studies, carbon farming feasibility studies in Ukraine, which potentially lead to new transactional flows and can be connected under bilateral offtake agreements. Now, then we are engaged with piloting and advancing innovative infrastructure solutions. Our work here has been sort of focused on the D-MRV bit that Chandra has alluded to, and I will speak to a bit later on. And then, of course, supporting transactions. Yes, I'm talking on the next slide on this. Sorry. So because we have considerable experience in carbon markets, running one of Europe's first carbon trading funds back in the days, and the multilateral carbon credit fund with the EIB under the Kyoto Protocol. And of course, it could serve as a good precursor for potential Article 6 transaction, that experience, because similar aggregation platforms and investment schemes could be developed to facilitate bilateral offtake agreements under the Paris rules, and thereby allowing stakeholders to benefit from EBID's good track record in our region, our good market knowledge and strong expertise in developing climate finance and green investments. So next slide. Yes, and on the infrastructure side, in terms of tools that we have been developing, we have been looking specifically on digitalized, what we call digitalized monitoring, reporting, and verification. Essentially an automated system that, other than a conventional MRV system that is fully relying on manual data and management, and thereby having issues around errors, around costs, and around consistencies, is trying to be more accurate, but is trying to be more transparent and reliable. Because strong MRV systems that credibly link investments to measurable results on the ground are instrumental in facilitating access to climate finance and carbon markets, and can build trust in the investment and stakeholder community involved in these type of transactions. Now we know that new and advanced digital technologies such as smart meters, digital sensors, blockchain, Chandra alluded to it, can reduce the transaction time and cost. And as these technologies are coming more into play and are being more widespread across the markets we operate, we try to sort of integrate them into the MRV's process. And we have been piloting around this. Now, sorry, next slide, please. We have at COP25, this is dating quite a while back, and it's good to be back now. We have at COP25 presented in a way preliminary results of a first D-MRV system prototype that we tried at a wind farm in Morocco, and that was sort of the start of this work. And over the last 2 or 3 years, or ever since, we have been basically trying to further advance that work, proceeding in 2020 with the development of a fully functional D-MRV system that can directly acquire project monitoring data, reporting on project performance, and enabling independent verification. And in order to instill or define some common practices, some common standards and principles into what digital monitoring and reporting and verification systems entail, we have developed also a D-MRV protocol, for which I will post a link in a bit, which is helpful for the international community to basically apply best standards. And this protocol, on the basis of this protocol, we are now this year and in the upcoming years trying to apply these standards on the ground in practice in some of the projects, renewable energy projects financed by the EBID, specifically with the renewable energy park in Jordan, where we are supporting with not only the monetization of carbon credits, but as well as the associated reporting obligations. And the D-MRV system application that we're involved with there is basically helping in the delivery and speed of this. Following this first pilot in Jordan, where we are currently fully engaged with, we are trying to roll this out to a more wider renewable energy framework, specifically a framework that has been supported by the climate investment funds, the Clean Technology Fund. And we are, of course, then trying to reincorporate these learnings from the practical experience into an updated D-MRV protocol, which then again can feed into the overall MRV process and discussions and inform, for instance, also how carbon standards such as VCS and gold standards are applying their methodologies. And that's where we see our role going forward. I stop here, and I'm happy then to take later on any kind of questions. Handing back to Zoe.
Zoe, is that me?
This is you.
Thank you. Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, this is me once again. Now I'll try to present some of ADB's work on the Article 6. But as my colleagues, both Chandra and Garrett highlighted, for ADB also, the climate change is a very important agenda, part of our long-term strategy, what we call Strategy 2030. And in that context, we are supporting our developing member countries in Asia and the Pacific to mainstream climate actions and helping them to implement their NDCs and helping them to kind of translating the targets articulated under their NDCs into real investment plans and investment opportunities. Under our Strategy 2030, we had set a target of mobilizing $80 billion from ADB's own financial resources in climate finance between 2019 and 2030. And very recently, we have upped this target to $100 billion. So this is once again, clearly signifies the importance of climate change in ADB's operations. In terms of the carbon markets, ADB has a very long-standing engagement with carbon markets. There are two streams under which we support our countries. One is to mobilize carbon finance through various carbon funds, trust funds that we design and manage. And essentially what we try to do is to mobilize carbon finance through international carbon market mechanisms to support our countries to overcome some of the barriers they face in terms of implementing advanced low carbon technologies in the projects. And the other stream that we work on is to provide technical and capacity building support to our countries to enhance their readiness. So this is what we have been doing ever since Kyoto Protocol. And we have, as we move forward, have been helping countries also to look into the bilateral mechanism, the JCM, the joint creating mechanism, and also establishing a trust fund to mobilize finance. The joint creating mechanism, as you know, is a forerunner of Article 6.2 and can provide lots of lessons. So we have been providing capacity building support and also mobilizing carbon finance for JCM. And ever since the Paris Agreement was signed, ADB has taken advanced action on supporting its member countries in Asia and the Pacific to enhance their readiness. So in that context, we established an Article 6 support facility that I'm going to give a very short overview. It's a $5 million facility that ADB has established with financial support from the government of Germany and Sweden. It's a capacity building facility through which we are providing support to our countries on three broad areas. One is for the policy development work. Countries would need to work towards a new set of policy framework to operationalize Article 6. That's what we are working. The second pillar of our support is to enhance their infrastructure, mostly in the direction of MRV, and for them to undertake corresponding adjustments, which are going to be the rock bed of international carbon markets. And the third pillar under which we are supporting our countries is to take some Article 6 pilots. Pilots, as you know, my colleagues also highlighted, could provide very useful information and experience for the countries to participate and mobilize more finance and also to enhance their readiness for the international carbon markets. So this facility has been up and running, and we have been supporting a number of countries in our region. But in this process, we have also been collaborating with our colleagues in the MDBs and also some of the other partners which are operating in this space. Very quickly on to the next slide, let me share with you some of the work that we have been doing. We identify that even though the countries in the region have a strong experience of using international carbon markets, because most of the CDM projects were hosted in Asia and the Pacific, and also most of the JCM projects are also hosted in Asia and the Pacific. But we still realize that the countries in the region would require a lot of hand-holding, capacity building, and training to position Article 6 mechanism in the broader climate policy architecture framework. So, and also the nature of the markets is going to be quite different from those we have seen under the Kyoto Protocol and even JCM. So therefore, countries would need to get certain support, and ADB has been very active in this space to provide capacity building and technical support for our countries. One of the things that we have done is to help countries to have a deeper understanding of the of climate policy architecture and where the carbon pricing sits over there, and how carbon markets form a very important part of the overall carbon pricing. And finally, how does Article 6 sits into carbon markets and the broader architecture, climate policy architecture countries can use. So the idea is for countries to take a holistic view of what Article 6 mechanisms can provide to them in meeting their climate ambition, to meet their NDCs, and how Article 6 can help them raise their ambition moving forward. So in that context, it's very important for countries, the policymakers in the region, to understand the overall lay of the land, of the overall landscape of different instruments, and enhance their ability to make informed choices of different carbon pricing instruments that would suit their national circumstances and their preferences. So this is one bit of work that ADB has been doing. The other piece of work that we have been doing, I'll take you to the next slide, is ADB has established ADB Roundtable on Article 6, and this is where we convene a short group of meeting where we invite some of the policymakers, most notably the Article 6 negotiators from different countries, for them to have a deeper understanding of various technical issues, so that they have a better understanding of the technicalities of the issues that have been holding negotiations, so that when they resume the negotiations, they are able to make very considered opinion and position on different topics. One interesting thing that we have been discussing on this ADB roundtable on Article 6 is the possibility to establish a carbon market alliance in Southeast Asia. The idea once again here is to work together with all our MDB colleagues and support countries to learn from each other and try to work on some of the things which are going to be common to all of the countries. Say, for example, the capacity building standards, or building the infrastructure to build synergies among their efforts. So that all of the countries are able to scale up their efforts almost at the same pace. So we have been working on this idea to develop carbon market alliance as we move forward from here. So on the next slide, let me present the third pillar of work that ADB has been undertaking in the Article 6 space. We have taken a thought leadership to inform the policymakers and other stakeholders to understand what are the different intricacies of Article 6. So we came up with the publication Decoding Article 6, and we have backed it up with Decoding Article 6 version 2. We have also brought up knowledge products on why do we think the joint trading mechanism is a good example of 6.2, and how 6.2 can benefit from the real life experience of projects and on the actions on the ground from which are pursued under JCM. And we are bringing another publication, Transitioning from Kyoto to Paris. This is where we talk about the transitioning of the CDM projects and units that is again one of the important topics being discussed. So these are some of the work that we are doing at a more regional level to enhance the capacity. The other bit of work that we have been doing, maybe on the next slide I'll present to you, is to provide in-country support to some of the countries that we are providing. I'll give a very short example that we have been supporting Vietnam and Indonesia on the next slide that I'll show you. So we are working with these two countries to help them develop policy framework to operationalize Article 6. So in that context, we have helped them to come up with a gap analysis. What are the policies which are in place, but most importantly, to come with recommendation, what are the different types of policy framework that they would need, and also what different institutional infrastructure would they require. And some of the very important lessons that we have learned is that countries need to see Article 6 in the context of the broader policy framework. Article 6 cannot be seen in isolation. It's going to be very important for countries to develop the policy framework in close coordination with other line ministries. And finally, it is going to be very important to take all the stakeholders together because of the simple nature of the different market mechanisms under Article 6. So some of the work, I mean, as I said, we are trying to do at the regional level. It may have global ramifications. We are able to contribute to the process. And some of the work that we are working is to support countries to meet their requirements, whether it is on the policy side, in the infrastructure side, it is on the institutional arrangements, and also the piloting work. So this brings me to the final slide to tell you that this is what we are trying to do, is to enhance the readiness of our developing member countries so that they are able to participate and take advantage of the new international carbon markets under Article 6. So I'll stop here, and let me now pass it on to my colleague from IDB. Adrian, please take it over from here.
Thank you very much, Vika. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So from what I heard so far, it looks like we have been less involved at the ADB, where I'm a senior economist on climate change, by the way. So less involved than you guys, working specifically on Article 6 projects, but we definitely have experience working on the broader issue of carbon pricing in the context of strategies to get to net zero emissions. And I think some of that experience can be relevant for this conversation. So as you know, governments and private organizations have been designing plans to get to net zero emissions by around 2050. And of course, the right to do so, because we've seen every month record-breaking hurricanes, floods, wildfires, droughts. We know there's a climate crisis. Ending the climate crisis requires to reach net zero emissions. And moreover, we know that getting to net zero emission, far from being a sacrifice, is an economic opportunity. For instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we found it can bring 1% additional growth and 15 million net new jobs by 2030. So that's why, by the way, the Vision 2025 of the IDB group emphasizes climate action as a part of the response to the pandemic. So it is in the context of net zero goal that we think about carbon pricing. And how can carbon pricing help? I want to make 3 points today, very quickly. The first point is that in terms of offset markets, we think it's very important to understand the difference between emission avoidance and emission removals, right? So just to be sure, emission avoidance can mean, for instance, paying land owners not to cut trees or building renewable power plants instead of fossil fuel power plants, while emission removal means reforestation, for instance, or using machines to suck the carbon out of the air and store it. So for the world to go to net zero, all sources of emissions need to be reduced drastically, and then residual emissions need to be compensated by removals of the same magnitude, right? What matters for the climate is what we actually emit in the atmosphere and what we actually remove, not the difference with the baseline. Therefore, we think it's important that countries and organizations aiming to offset their emissions really focus on removals and or increasingly focus on removals and progressively less on avoidance. This is at least one of the recommendations in the last Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition report on the carbon pricing and net zero, to which we have contributed. And I also think, by the way, that NGOs and the private sector are increasingly going in that direction. I don't know if you've seen, for instance, the reports in the journal Nature, published by some staff from Microsoft, reporting their quest to procure emission removal certificates and the disappointment to only find or mostly find emission avoidance certificates for sale. So the second point I want to make is that carbon markets, of course, are a way to ensure that a carbon price emerges. And that's great because it provides funding and it provides powerful incentives to the market. But importantly, history has taught us that price reforms can be extremely unpopular and very difficult to implement if they're not carefully designed and prepared. For instance, we have 30 years of experience with fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon taxes around the world. And this experience has shown that they work much better when governments agree up front that these reforms have positive impacts, but they also have negative impacts on some firms and some households. And it's important to acknowledge these impacts and prepare compensation packages and discuss them with those most affected well ahead of any price hike. So all of that to say that if carbon markets, including carbon markets linked, for instance, to Article 6, are going to create price increases, which is part of the objective, then it's important for the political acceptability that they come with compensatory policies too. And then the last point I wanted to make, I'm sure nobody here needs to hear it, but I'll still say it. And even if it's become a little bit of a cliche, actually, VK just mentioned something similar. There's no silver bullet. And we should be cautious about not overselling or overpromising what carbon markets can achieve. Right? I see two big kinds of reasons. The first one is that the cost is not an important barrier anymore. Right? If you look at it's not always an important barrier anymore. If you look at the wind and solar, we know they have become the most affordable energy in the world and in human history. Right? And electric vehicles are increasingly cheaper, than they used to be, thanks to progress in batteries, and they're much cheaper to operate than petrol cars. So in many cases, the zero carbon solutions are already price competitive, but there are other barriers, many barriers to the adoption of zero carbon solutions, even when the cost is fine. So financing is one, for instance. You can have high upfront cost, and for sure, carbon markets can be part of the financing solution. But there are also so many other small obstacles, I don't remember how to pronounce that, to the transition that net zero carbons are not going to remove. And governments will still need to look at all these other barriers and policies to remove them, again, as VK just said. For instance, designing electricity markets that prioritize cheap renewable over incumbent technologies, or make it legal and convenient to connect renewable energy sources to the grid, or adapting public procurement rules to let business models emerge for electric buses and allow them to compete against more polluting diesel. Or planning livable cities where people can actually take the bus or the train or bike or walk to shops and service centers. So all of that is examples of policies that are needed and that carbon pricing is not going to resolve, right? So we think the best way to investigate these barriers is to start from a comprehensive multi-sector strategy to net zero emissions around 2050, for instance, and then understand what changes are needed in all sectors, then investigate barriers to the changes, and then ask what policies can remove those barriers. And of course, carbon markets are going to be part of the solutions, but once you have a clear picture, you usually find it's not the only problem, not the only solution. So that's the three things our analysis suggests that it's important for policymakers to consider. So again, favor emission removals rather than avoidance. Beware that price hikes often need compensatory policies to be politically acceptable, and don't think of carbon markets as a silver bullet. So I know this is a cliche and everybody agrees. So thanks again so much. I think Gareth from the African Development Bank speaks next.
Okay, thank you very much. This is Gareth Phillips from the African Development Bank. I'm the manager of climate and environmental finance. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we're doing under Article 6.8, where we are developing this mechanism called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. But before I just go into the slides, I just want to give a quick promotion for an event that we will hold on ITMO's and Article 6.2 work that we're doing here at the AFDB Pavilion on tomorrow, Tuesday, the 2nd, from 1 p.m. So there we'll present some of the work that we've done to explore the opportunities and barriers for ITMO transactions in West Africa, and we'll present 4 case studies that we're planning to take forward to try to develop into mitigation projects. So if anybody's interested, please do come and join us there. But now let me focus my attention on Article 6.8 because this is often overlooked element of Article 6, and we think that actually it has tremendous potential to do a number of very interesting things. Next slide, please, Zoe. The thing about adaptation is that, generally speaking, adaptation projects don't deliver strong revenue flows. And of course, that means that they are often not financially attractive. They may be economically attractive, but generally speaking, not financially attractive. And that means that the private sector will not invest into adaptation projects. And we think that that is the crux of the problem. If we found a way to pay the private sector for delivering adaptation benefits or for contributing towards adaptation needs, then they would come and they would invest, and we would see many benefits from the entrepreneurial skills, the development of technologies, and so on from the private sector. So that is what we have tried to do through the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. It is designed to provide a transparent and credible mechanism to determine the level, and by that we mean the quantum and the duration of financial support that is required to make a project attractive to a private sector project developer. And actually, when we compare this as a non-market approach compared to market-based approaches, we see some very interesting comparisons against our previous experience of working with the Clean Development Mechanism and so on. So, for example, the ABM is what we describe as a minimum concessionality model. We aim to find the amount of finance that a project developer requires to make the project attractive and make that finance available, but not a lot more. We're not trying to create a rent-seeking or a rent-producing model where you generate adaptation benefits for many years to come and generate a rent from the project. We just want to provide enough money to make the project attractive to the private sector. And secondly, when we use this approach, it means that we can internalize all the transaction costs. So even though we're going to be doing a lot of small-scale projects, and typically, of course, they have higher transaction costs, we can internalize those costs so that the ultimate consumer of the adaptation benefit mechanism or the adaptation benefits coming from the project, that is the entity that pays those costs. So we think that this can give good value for money to donors. And through this mechanism, we invite purchasers, which would be governments or those who can afford to do so, and ultimately consumers, to sign what we're calling an adaptation benefits purchase agreement to pay project developers the level of finance that they required on delivery of the certified adaptation benefits. Next slide, please. So you'll see then that once you have an adaptation benefit purchase agreement signed with a credible off-taker, then that can act as a form of collateral to help project developers attract equity and loans and other forms of investment. And here we also recognize that local communities and those that will often host adaptation benefit projects can bring non-financial materials and resources to the project, including land and biodiversity and labor and indigenous technical knowledge, because these are critical components of adaptation projects, which generally are not widely recognized, and credit isn't really given to project developers for bringing those kinds of resources to the table. Now, the ultimate purchaser of the certified adaptation benefit receives a packet of unique information that describes the finance that has been contributed, the additional finance and in-kind contributions that have been mobilized as a result of that, and then the unique and genuine adaptation benefits that have been created by the project. And if the host country has signed a letter of approval, then these benefits and the contributions can be declared or reported under the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. So a country can say, this is what we have contributed to help this host country meet their adaptation needs. And that can be done in a credible and transparent process to show the support that's been given. And at the same time, the host country reports that as support received. And at the moment, at the African Development Bank, we are piloting this mechanism. We've launched a pilot phase to run from 2019 to 2023. And our objective in 2023 is to demonstrate to the parties a working mechanism that shows how we can use this finance to stimulate investment into adaptation projects. Next slide, please, sorry. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk through this in detail. This is just a graphic to show that we have a project cycle established. Actually, we learn heavily from the Clean Development Mechanism, and we follow a very similar approach with third-party validation and verification and the use of approved methodologies. What is interesting here is, and we learned this from the Clean Development Mechanism, is that relying on external third parties avoids the bottleneck of going through a board. So, for example, as you go to the Green Climate Fund, going through the Secretariat and through their approval process, or going through the GEF, or indeed going through the African Development Bank. So we know from our previous experience that this business model or this project cycle can handle large numbers of projects, and we think it's very robust. Of course, we're not creating compliance grade units for compliance, for example, under the Kyoto Protocol or in the EU emissions trading scheme. So the level of certainty required in the verification process is quite different. So there's a number of very interesting points around that. I won't go into those in detail now. Next slide, please, Zoe. So this is my last slide, just to talk briefly about our next steps. As I say, we are piloting this. We have 2 pilot projects underway. We have 3 methodologies submitted or about to be submitted to the methodology panel. And what we are now trying to do is to create the African Adaptation Benefit Fund, which would be a fund that would allow us to sign purchase agreements with project developers. And here, again, we model what we did with the Clean Development Mechanism. Some of you may recall the World Bank Prototype Carbon Fund that signed early offtake agreements with project developers to kickstart that process. So basically, we want to do exactly the same thing. And we're hoping, actually, here at COP, we will be able to mobilize funds to do just that. And we think that if we can establish this fund, it will give us resources to support the work of the ABM Executive Committee, to provide some technical assistance grants to project developers, as well as signing some of these early offtake agreements. Now, interestingly, if we sort of pan out a little bit, we think that this non-market approach can also be applied to activities around biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And in fact, I would say that those are also key adaptation activities, but we could also use them specifically for biodiversity. And interestingly, I think they can be applied to measure or to hard to measure or high GWP mitigation projects or mitigation projects in situations that are not yet ready to create mitigation outcomes. So if a country isn't yet ready to host a registry and sort of sign an MOU and so on, then we think this same approach, this minimum concessionality model, where we provide finance to meet the marginal costs of an activity, we think that this can also be used for a range of mitigation and other kinds of activities. So that concludes my presentation. If you'd like to know more about the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, then you can check out our new webpage. It's still a little bit under development, but it is operational. That's abmechanism.org. And let me hand back to VK. And thank you very much indeed for your attention. Back to you, VK.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Very insightful presentation on this very innovative ABM. Really look forward to bringing some pilots on the ground, and I'm sure that a lot of countries and project developers, especially in the adaptation field, can benefit from this mechanism. And this is also very important for countries in Asia and the Pacific. So I think lots of lessons need to be learned out of this one as well. Okay, so thank you very much, all MDB colleagues, for presenting your work. This has been really fantastic. We have done about an hour of the 90 minutes allocated. So we have about 30 minutes. So what I intend to do is to have a little bit of a panel conversation first before we open the floor for some questions from the audience. So for the panel conversation, we have 2 very enlightened participants, Philip Ischer, who is the Program Manager in the Economic Cooperation and Development State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, Switzerland. And then we also have Mr. Dauda, who is the chair of the methodology panel of the ABM Executive Committee, and he's also head of the climate practice at the Islamic Development Bank. So we will have a couple of questions for them, but let me first start with going to Philip. So Philip, I mean, you've been very active in this space on the development of Article 6. So now that having seen the presentation by different MDBs, how do you see the work that MDBs are doing for the international carbon markets benefit what you are trying, Switzerland is trying to do to achieve? And in your view, what more could be done by MDBs? Philip?
Thank you very much, VK, for the question and for inviting me, being present, being part of this interesting panel. Yes, with regard to your question, I mean, the work done by the MDBs and on operationalization carbon markets is benefiting directly Switzerland's aim to use Article 6 as a mean to achieve its own NDC. I mean, just let me give a few examples. For example, with its knowledge products, the Climate Market Club supports potential future market participants in at least 3 different areas. And all those areas are important, as we have seen so far, for operationalization Article 6. So firstly, the knowledge products provide guidance and insights on how to structure national authorization processes of concrete Article 6 projects or programs. That's a core element. And what has to be, so the question is then what has to be taken into account when designing those processes, or then what are the political challenges and how can they be mitigated? Also, all those elements are addressed in one or another way in those products. Then secondly, the knowledge products indicate the elements a national legal framework should contain in the area of Article 6, and they also help to link the use of Article 6 to the national NDCs. Or in other words, they help then also to develop something like an Article 6 strategy in the context of national NDCs. And thirdly, the products address a series of questions of overarching importance. So I just wanted to mention a few. For example, they are the structure and the use of a whitelist, or how overselling risks can be avoided, and what has to be considered when, for example, setting a price. How then, in the end, prices have to look like, or most probably will look like, because there will be a difference. For example, if you compare it with the current CDM, then. Of course, there are also some more elements. So besides those, the Carbon Market Club function as an exchange platform. And I'm sure, as we have also seen, not only the Carbon Market Club, but the same is also true what the Asian Development Bank is doing, what EBRD are doing. So they provide a platform which can be used to exchange views, lessons learned, participants come together. And that actually is essential when learning new things. Then by bringing different actors together, the club, for example, creates an environment that benefits the creation of a common understanding of concrete challenges. Also, this is very important. So we also need a language that everybody understands and knows that we actually are speaking from the same thing, and also have the same challenges in mind. And then one last thing I would like to mention here is the work the Climate Warehouse, and this is now typical for the warehouse, is doing, because it's probably the most visionary element of the work of the World Bank, at least in the area of Article 6. Here we have the hope of Switzerland and expectation that in the long run, the warehouse will help to create a market with fungible products by providing a meta platform that increases transparency and facilitates and also the exchange of products or credits. So much from what we as Switzerland benefit directly from those activities. And then maybe to the second half of your questions, what more could or should be done? I mean, one question is actually how to create an Article 6 setups in a way that they become financially self-sustainable. I mean, that's something that we are seeing a little bit everywhere. All countries are confronted with the personal and also financial resource constraints in the short as well as in the long run. So it will be a question of, it's important to answer those questions, how in the long run those setups can then actually become financially sustainable. Linked with this is actually then how to solve the serious resource constraint of national level or at national level. I mean, when we work with countries, way often we see the people we interact directly, they know what they are talking about, they're very experienced, but we also have seen that there are maybe one or two persons. That is, if, for example, one of those two decides to go and look for another challenge, so then we might be without a partner. We might have still signed a contract with a country, but the people then necessary and important to implement those agreements will be gone, and because they have just taken up some new assignments. Then another question will also be actually, how do we avoid over-engineering of processes? So we always have to keep in mind that probably the simpler the better. I know there exists also a conflict then with the question of that we have to be we have to do everything that our activities then also guarantee that the results are environmentally integer. I get this, no doubts, but nonetheless, we have to keep in mind that processes have to be applicable. And there may be 2 or 3 other points. I mean, in order to give clear market signals, countries should more work on carbon market budgets, or should start to develop carbon market budget and also communicate them to the broader market actors, so that they get an understanding what they can expect. So what is actually the volume, the magnitude we are talking about? So how much in the long run a country is willing and also able to sell? Without this in mind, I guess it will always be difficult and quite risky for project developer then just enter this market. And linked with this, of course, is also the question, how do we also have more to work on the question how Article 6 in the long run can be scaled up. I mean, we know we are still looking, we are still waiting for the first pilot project. Oh, I mean, this is the third thing. And we know that we will face quite many challenges and hurdles in order to not only operationalize Article 6, but then actually also to scale it up. I mean, we all know, although it's necessary, the adjustment mechanism is here to stay, and this is important, but it is not a difficult element when our goal is actually that we want to scale up Article 6. And we have to see how we, if we find methods to at least overcome some of the barriers that directly come with corresponding adjustment, or whether there are actually other means are necessary. And then what's also important, if we really want to move forward, is that finally first projects actually have to be implemented so that we can learn from them, and then also get to understand better how processes then can and have to be streamlined. Yeah. So that's a little bit, that's from my side. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Philip, for sharing your insightful thoughts on the work that is being done by MDBs, and also how the markets could be developed further here. There's a question in the chat box. Let me I'll take that liberty to pose this question to you. What level of prices are emerging in the kind of projects that you described, or what kind of prices could be expected, or how the prices are going to be moved this point onwards? If you could share some of your thoughts, initial thoughts, Philip.
I mean, at least in the area of Article 6, the price will no longer only be defined by implementation costs. So there will be an additional layer of costs. We can call them opportunity costs or risk mitigation costs. And that means also that probably those approach implementer will have to deal with 2 different price setting bodies. Let's put it that way. One is actually the implementer of projects. And then it will also be maybe a government entity. And those costs might arise in different forms. It can be that you say, okay, maybe you come to a sharing agreement that you say, okay, maybe 25 or 50% of the created credits will remain in the country. From the cost perspective, it only means that the price will double immediately, but that could also be an outcome. But with regard how actually the costs will look like in the end, that's hard to say. I do not know, but I expect quite some substantial differences.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very, very, very interesting, and probably could be the topic of one dedicated session on this one. I look forward to organizing one as we move forward from here. But for now, let us move on to the second panelist, Mr. Dauda. I'll request you to switch on your camera if that is possible somehow. And then my question is, how do you think methodology approval process for the creation of certified adaptation benefit facilitate the financial flows for supporting adaptation projects? You know, we come from the CDM world where the development of CDM methodology became very complex in the end and required very high level of expertise, and also the third-party costs on validation and verification. And some of these challenges might arise for ABM. So do you share that view? And if you have a difference of opinion, why do you think so? Mr. Dauda, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your comments on some of these questions.
Yes, thank you very much. So connecting from a coffee here at the central station, I couldn't make it to the pavilion. But look, the adaptation benefits mechanisms provide a new and innovative way to get finance for adaptation for a specific category of stakeholders, and also targeting specific category of organizations and donors. So which specific category of stakeholders? You have the micro and small private sector organizations that usually do not have access to finance. You have the non-profit organizations. You have the local governments. Those are the main recipients, those that can really, by developing these methodologies that are verifiable, reportable, measurable, they can help in really showing that they can deliver adaptation benefits. So now the whole certification process has to be robust, and they should be able to deliver these adaptation certificates. This is very important, and this will be appealing to international organizations or philanthropist organizations or donors that are looking as well at delivering on climate finance, supporting climate finance in developing countries, supporting adaptation in developing countries, where you see all these NDCs being developed. You will have the adaptation communications coming. So it's going to be important for that category of stakeholders to show their commitment to support, but it has to be in a transparent way. So transparency on one side in terms of showing that you are supporting the 100 billion goal on climate finance, and transparency on the other side from the stakeholder to show that they can deliver robust, measurable, verifiable adaptation benefits. And also, when you look at the economic, social, and environment benefits of these adaptation actions at local level, they are also appealing for private sector organizations. So hopefully, once we get these very robust methodologies being applied, it will help in increasing the level of adaptation finance globally, and achieving this at least 50% of adaptation finance being part of the 100 billion goal, where at this stage we are far, far, far away from.
Thank you. Those are some very interesting ideas. Could not agree with you more that the transparency is going to be something very important, but the ABM processes need to be very robust, but at the same time be simple, so that more adaptation finance could be facilitated through these very interesting and innovative mechanisms as we move forward from here. We are left with now what 15 minutes now. So let me open the floor for the audience to raise any questions that they may have, and I'll be looking at the chat box. So requesting the audience to please post their questions in the chat box. So while I wait for the questions, new questions to come up, there's one question that let me pose to my colleagues, the MDBs, that several of these mechanisms are directed to finance individual projects, meaning mitigation actions. Any mechanism that involves directly countries to support them implementing policies, helping citizens' behavior and choices. So essentially, the question is whether there could be certain mechanisms that could be directed towards the behavior, the citizens' behavior in a certain particular manner. So let me ask Gareth, if you would like to go first, whether ABM could somehow influence this, and then maybe to Chandra if he has any thoughts onto this one. And I look forward to more questions coming in from the audience. Gareth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, VK, and thanks for the question. Well, from the point of view of the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, we're very open as to what is considered to be an adaptation approach. And I know there's a lot of emphasis on climate rationale amongst, for example, the Green Climate Fund. But we have our methodology panel, which Dauda is chairing, and we're empowering them to provide guidance as to what kind of activities contribute towards adaptation. So there is certainly scope for project developers to come forward or governments to come forward with policies that can promote adaptation actions and then to develop facilities for that. So, for example, we could see support for the development of local adaptation plans as being a viable ABM project where the deliverable is a completed adaptation plan developed following a clearly defined stakeholder consultation process. And then there's a cost associated with that. And the off-taker or the purchaser of the adaptation benefits is the person or the entity that is paying for that work. So, we are certainly very open to see broader definitions of what would constitute adaptation. And that's the task of the adaptation panel to agree if those activities constitute adaptation. Thanks, VK. Back to you.
Thank you, Gareth. Chandra, would you like to come in?
Yeah. So one of the things that I indicated in the opening slide was the usual mechanism for the multilateral development banks is to finance programs at the national level through programs that countries put in place. And these typically would involve not just direct investment in activities, but also changes in policies, incentive frameworks, and so on. So much of the work that the multilateral banks do is through our client governments, and therefore, it is directed at the national level. It is directed towards programs, which then get implemented at the activity level. In terms of direct programs for behavioral change, I think those form components of broader engagement that the multilateral development banks have with our client countries. Clearly, for the scale of changes that are going to be needed, perhaps there needs to be a greater focus on that element, the element of behavioral changes, the lifestyle changes, the kind of changes that are necessary to take us away from the dangerous path that we as humanity have taken. It's certainly a very, very important element and certainly should be a greater part of the engagement of the multilateral banks. VK, if you allow me, I wanted to just emphasize on the other part, on the pricing, which Philip started on, which I think is a very important element and touches on something that Adrian said as well. As we move towards our implementation of Article 6 and the concept of corresponding adjustment moves us away from the traditional view of pricing and linkages to the higher level of ambition of NDCs. As Philip was indicating, there are two elements to the pricing of the Article 6 unit, if you will, Article 6.2 in particular. One is the cost of the implementation itself, and the recognition that corresponding adjustment then requires the country to undertake additional activity to add to its NDC towards the end. So the two take place at different parts of the marginal abatement curve. The cost that you incur today to implement a solar project adds to, and if you sell it through Article 6.2, it adds to the final ton that you have to deliver as a part of your NDC, and that can come at a very different cost. And I think the point that Adrian was making is to recognize that solar and wind costs are in many instances at grid parity, and even if you include them in Article 6, you're actually adding to the ambition of your NDC. And to recognize the two-part element of cost or prices of Article 6, I think is a very important element. And VK, as you were saying, probably needs to be a topic of a full session by itself. Back to you, VK.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chandra, for sharing your thoughts onto this one. There's one interesting question that has come on the chat box, and I'll ask my MDB colleagues to come in. Offsets lost credibility because consumers felt it was fake. Do you envisage that corporates will buy Article 6 credits or just donors? Who would like to pick this from the panel? Gareth? Adrian?
Yeah, sorry, so someone had the hand reason. No, I think it's a good question, and it touches upon my first point, right? There's two kinds of offsets. There's offsets for emission avoidance and offset for emission removals. Again, avoidance means I was about to cut the forest, but then you paid me and I didn't cut the forest. And I would say, I'm exaggerating, of course. I would say this is the kind of projects presented this way that I just made exaggerating, that can have lead the public to find it a bit, and I don't remember what word you use, right? But to lose confidence in this kind of offsets. But I think this is very different from carbon removals, right? This is an emerging kind of offsets where you really make sure not to reduce emissions compared to a baseline, but to make sure you actually absorb emissions from the atmosphere, either you planting trees or maybe in 10 years using like technologies that directly capture carbon from the air. I think there's no reason this second kind of offsets would lose credibility if they are implemented correctly. And again, I mentioned this paper that I found fascinating in Nature, written by some staff from Microsoft, where they talk exactly about that. Microsoft wanted to offset the emissions, making sure they buy removals, not avoidance certificates. And they really make the point for it. They say it's very difficult today because it's not very common, but I think it could be a big part of the future.
Anyone else would like to come in on this question?
Yeah, maybe I can come in from just from the experiences we made so far from Switzerland. I mean, we know with regard to Article 6, there is interest also from corporates to participate in Article 6 work because they see the difference between a credit on which actually there's a corresponding adjustment on it, or just a normal, regular, more CDM-like credit. So it's although it might be exactly the same activity, but because in one case there's a corresponding adjustment on it, as a ITMO, another one is just a mitigation outcome, it's a difference. and there exists, of course, an interest. The problem will more be whether those corporates will also be able to find those products on the market. So at the moment, I don't think it's a demand problem, it's a supply. So the bottleneck is the supply.
Wow.
And maybe just one last element with regard to what has just been said with regard to offsets, removal or avoidance. I mean, just to make that clear, for Article 6 focus in the first place on avoidance and not on removal. So, for example, activities which have the forest as a center will most probably not be eligible, at least not in the Switzerland's case.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip, and highlighting that supply is the constraint right now. It's not the demand. That's very, very interesting to note. I have one question for my colleagues here, is that how to set expectations from COP26? What do you see coming up in the next few days, especially in the context of negotiations on Article 6? So what can people in the audience can expect to come out at the end of this COP, and what does the road ahead looks like to you? Maybe I'll request Chandra to start and then Gareth to pick up, and maybe Edwin can supplement.
Certainly, from our point of view, there's a huge amount of expectations and a hope that the global community can come together and reach an agreement, not just on Article 6, but on a higher level of climate ambition in order to address this challenge. Certainly, I have to temper my optimism with some sense of realism, where the signals we hear are not all that positive. But I leave it to you, Gareth, to VK and others who are actually there in Glasgow to tell us what is happening and keep the hope going in terms of action. So back to you, VK.
Thank you, Chandra. Gareth, you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. I hope it's me and not Gareth. We sound quite similar these days. And apologies for my background. It was a quiet corner when I started. Look, I'm also optimistic like Chandra. I hope that, and it's vitally important that we get progress on Article 6 and we get agreement how to move forward. That is really, it's no coincidence that we are holding this event at the start of the week. The African Development Bank, we're holding our ITMO event tomorrow. I boosted it up the agenda because we want to try to tell the negotiators that we are working on these, we are solving the issues, we have pilots underway, not only addressing 6.2, 6.4, but also Article 6.8. We have a complete toolkit to show how to move forward in this space. And really, it is critical. We cannot leave COP26 without agreement on Article 6 because it is the main route through which the private sector are going to engage. So any negotiators on this call, please pull out the stops and give us the results. Thanks, VK. Back to you.
Thank you. Edwin, any last words from you on this one?
Yeah, no, I focus on two things. One, the $100 billion pledge, and second, as many countries as we have with strong strategies to get to net zero that look at what needs to happen in all the sectors, what are all the barriers to achieve that, and policy packages to remove those barriers. I think that's the best that can come out of the COP.
Gareth, any thoughts you have on this one?
Yeah, no, I mean, the hope dies last. I think we are at the beginning of this big event, and there was a bit of radio silence over the last two years. So it's good that the world community is again together, and I'm optimistic that actually an agreement can be reached, because in a way the event is now as important as the 2015 Paris Agreement, and a lot of time passed in the meantime. And the time is ticking, and the window of opportunity is getting closer and closer. So let not perfection stand in the way of just good practice. Over to you.
Yeah,
Thank you. No, I completely agree with my colleagues. There's a huge expectation, and for all the right reasons, as I said at the beginning, that there's a huge gap and there's a need for countries to raise ambition. And if countries need to raise ambition, we have to pull all stops here and need to mobilize any sources of finances that are possible. And Article 6 can be very important instrument that can help countries to achieve their NDCs and raise the ambition, as I said. So I join my colleagues in requesting the negotiators that we get a path forward from here. But looking at the conversations going forward, I mean, we were there at the last COP, and we thought that we were getting certain landing zones. So I am quite optimistic at this point in time for a good progress, and I think there is a general sense of urgency on the action that needs to be taken, and especially in the Article 6 also. And could not agree more that the private sector definitely needs the additional financing resources to make those investment decisions, to implement advanced low carbon technologies or business models that are really very, very important to pursue the path of decarbonization. If you're looking at the transition, we'll move to the net zero. I think Article 6 is going to be very, very important. So we will be watching this topic with a great amount of interest as we move forward from here. We are left with like about a minute from here from the closure. Let me first of all thank all my colleagues from MDBs, and also our expert panelists, both Mr. Davda and Philip, for sharing their thoughts. Key points from the conversation and the presentation that have come very clearly that the climate change is a very important agenda for MDBs that is required to support countries to implement their NDCs and translate those NDCs into real investment decisions and climate action onto the ground. And then there is an already agreed
Now, so maybe happy to conclude the session here. We seem to have had problem with VK, but thank you all for joining, and look forward to hearing from those of you who are at the COP, and good luck to everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.